They mocked and humiliated their black stepsister, convinced she'd never amount to anything. But years later, life took an unexpected turn, and now she's living the life they never thought she could. Subscribe for more powerful stories and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? The sun cast a soft, warm glow over the neatly arranged garden where the wedding ceremony of Thomas and Loretta took place. A mix of friends, family, and distant acquaintances gathered on the lawn, murmuring in excitement and curiosity. Loretta, a striking woman with deep brown skin and short coiled hair, looked radiant in her lace-trimmed wedding gown. By her side stood her daughter, Sariah, a quiet 12-year-old with a shy gaze and a scar tracing across her right cheek, an ever-present reminder of the accident that changed her life. Thomas, dressed in a sharp black suit, glanced lovingly at Loretta, his heart swelling with pride and a renewed sense of hope. His decision to marry Loretta had not come lightly, and now, looking at the two people he hoped to build a new life with, he was certain he had made the right choice. Yet, beneath the surface of celebration, tension simmered. At the edge of the crowd, Thomas's daughters from his first marriage, Emily and Claire, stood stiffly. They wore polite smiles, but their eyes told a different story. Emily, the older of the two at 24, crossed her arms, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled in waves. Claire, only 2 years younger, looked equally displeased, tapping her manicured nails against her glass of champagne. "This whole thing feels like a joke," Emily whispered to Claire, her lips barely moving. Claire smirked. "He's lost his mind. Marrying a poor black woman with a kid? Can't wait to see how long this lasts." Their whispers carried venom, though they were careful to keep their words out of their father's earshot. The sisters exchanged glances, both unwilling to make any real effort to mask their disapproval. For them, Loretta's presence represented an intrusion into their lives, an unwelcome disruption to the family they once knew. When Thomas invited his daughters to greet their new stepmother and stepsister, the tension thickened. "Come on, girls," he urged gently. "Let's make them feel welcome." Emily offered a forced smile and extended her hand to Loretta. "Welcome, I guess." Loretta, unbothered by the cold greeting, accepted the handshake graciously. "Thank you, Emily. It's nice to finally meet you both." Claire's handshake was even more reluctant, her grip barely there. "I just hope you know what you're getting into." Her words dripped with passive aggression, though the smile on her face remained fixed. Sariah, standing awkwardly beside her mother, shrank under the judgmental stares. Her fingers brushed the side of her face self-consciously, tracing the faint scar along her cheek. Emily and Claire's eyes lingered on it for a moment too long, making Sariah shift uncomfortably. "Poor thing," Claire whispered just loudly enough for Emily to hear, as if her face wasn't already a mess. Loretta gave Sariah's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, but the girl's discomfort was palpable. She was used to being the target of cruel comments, but something about Emily and Claire's scrutiny made her feel more isolated than ever. Thomas watched the interaction closely, his heart sinking. He had hoped his daughters would at least try to accept his new family, but it was clear that hostility simmered just beneath the surface. He could only hope that in time, things would change. After the ceremony, the family gathered around a long dinner table set under the stars. Lights twinkled above them, casting a soft glow over the guests as laughter and conversation filled the air. Thomas tried to ease the atmosphere, raising a toast to his new life with Loretta and Sariah. "To new beginnings," he announced, holding his glass high, "and to family." Loretta smiled warmly, clinking her glass with his. But as the toast continued around the table, Emily and Claire remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, Emily pulled Claire aside. "This is all for show," she muttered. "You watch. She's just using him, probably trying to get a slice of whatever's left of Mom's inheritance." Claire nodded in agreement. "And that kid? She doesn't belong here. She'll never fit in." The bitterness in their voices was undeniable, and it was clear to both sisters that they had no intention of accepting Loretta or Sariah as part of their lives. Back at their new home, Sariah curled up on the edge of her bed, clutching her pillow tightly. The day had been overwhelming, and despite her mother's reassurances, the cruelty of Emily and Claire's remarks stung deeply. She ran her fingers along the scar that marred her cheek, remembering the accident that had left it there, a freak car crash that could have cost her life. Loretta had saved her, but at a cost neither of them could forget. "I'll never fit in," Sariah whispered to herself, blinking back tears. "They'll never stop seeing me as ugly." Meanwhile, downstairs, Thomas and Loretta sat together on the living room couch, savoring the quiet moment after the long day. Thomas leaned his head against her shoulder, trying to find comfort in her presence, but the encounter with his daughters weighed heavily on his mind. "I thought they'd at least give you a chance," he murmured. Loretta gave a soft, sad smile. "They need time, Thomas. It's not easy for them. Change never is." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just wanted today to be perfect." Loretta took his hand in hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. "It was perfect in its own way. We have each other. That's what matters." But deep down, Thomas knew that the road ahead would not be easy. His daughters were not ready to let go of their prejudice, and Sariah's struggles were only beginning. He could sense the weight of unspoken resentment pressing down on all of them, threatening to fracture his new family before it even had a chance to grow. As the weeks went by, the tension between Sariah and her new stepsisters only grew. Emily and Claire made no effort to hide their disdain, whispering insults and making cruel remarks whenever they thought no one was listening. Sariah tried to avoid them, but their words followed her everywhere she went, chipping away at her confidence. "Look at her," Claire sneered one afternoon as Sariah passed by the living room. "She's like a stray cat Dad picked up off the street." Emily smirked. "She should be grateful. It's probably the closest she'll ever get to a real family." Sariah bit her lip, her heart aching with every word. She knew better than to confront them. It would only make things worse. But the hurt festered inside her, making her feel smaller and more isolated with each passing day. Upstairs, Thomas sat at his desk, staring at an old photograph of his daughters from before his first wife passed away. He missed the days when his family felt whole, but he knew that those days were gone. All he could do now was hope that somehow he could find a way to bridge the growing divide between his children and his new wife. But deep down, he feared that no amount of love or patience would be enough to heal the wounds that prejudice had already inflicted on his family. The air felt heavy with grief on the morning of Loretta's funeral. A cloudy sky loomed above, as if nature itself mourned her passing. Thomas stood at the front of the small church, dressed in a black suit that suddenly felt too tight, his heart burdened by the loss of his wife. At his side was Sariah, her small frame trembling with silent tears. She wore a modest black dress, and though she tried to remain composed, the absence of her mother was a wound too deep to conceal. Inside the chapel, friends and relatives from Loretta's community gathered to pay their respects. Quiet sobs and whispered condolences filled the space, creating an atmosphere of sorrow and reverence. But among the mourners, two figures stood apart from the grieving crowd, Emily and Claire. Dressed in expensive black clothing, the sisters maintained an air of aloofness. They sat near the back of the chapel, whispering among themselves, their disdain palpable even on this somber day. "Can you believe this?" Claire muttered, leaning toward Emily. "Look at them, all pretending this woman was something special." Emily's lips curled into a faint smirk, as if she deserved to be part of this family. She was never meant to be here. Claire's gaze drifted toward Sariah, who sat beside Thomas, clutching a folded tissue in her small hands. Her face was pale with grief, the scar along her cheek catching the soft light of the chapel. "And that kid," Claire whispered, her voice filled with contempt, "like a little orphan no one wanted." Emily chuckled softly. "Well, now she is." Their quiet laughter went unnoticed by most, but not by Thomas. Standing at the front of the chapel, he caught their sneering expressions from the corner of his eye, and his heart sank even further. His daughters couldn't even put their animosity aside for one day, Loretta's day of farewell. As the service began, the pastor spoke soothing words about love, loss, and finding peace in the afterlife. But for Thomas, peace felt unreachable. He glanced down at Sariah, whose small hands tightened around his. He could feel her pain, raw and unrelenting, and it mirrored his own. When it came time for Thomas to speak, he rose slowly, his legs feeling as if they might buckle beneath him. He cleared his throat, but the words he had prepared seemed to evaporate. He looked out at the audience, at Loretta's friends and relatives who had come to honor her memory. Then his gaze settled on Emily and Claire. They sat with expressions that ranged from bored to dismissive, as if the entire ceremony was an inconvenience. Emily's fingers tapped rhythmically against her knee, while Claire checked her phone under the pew. A surge of anger welled up in Thomas, but he swallowed it down, unwilling to cause a scene on the day meant to celebrate his wife's life. His voice wavered as he began. She was everything. She made me believe in love again, and she gave me hope when I thought I'd lost it all. She was kind, generous, and patient with everyone she met. Thomas's gaze flickered toward his daughters again, hoping for some sign of acknowledgement, but none came. They sat with stone-cold expressions, unmoved by his words. "She brought light into my life," he continued, though it was becoming harder to speak, "and through her I gained not just love, but a daughter, Sariah." At the mention of Sariah's name, Emily let out a barely audible scoff, and Claire rolled her eyes. The subtle gesture did not escape Thomas or Sariah, who lowered her head in shame, as if their disdain was her fault. After the service, the mourners gathered outside the church for the burial. A cool wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and wilting flowers. As Loretta's casket was lowered into the ground, Thomas stood silently beside Sariah, his arm draped protectively around her shoulder. Emily and Claire lingered at a distance, their expressions untouched by sorrow. "This is absurd," Emily muttered under her breath. "All this for her? I can't believe we're even here." Claire smirked. "At least it's over now." Sariah heard them, though she pretended not to. But their words clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. Tears welled in her eyes, and she clenched her fists, wishing more than anything that her mother were still alive to protect her from their cruelty. Back at home, the atmosphere inside the house was suffocating. Without Loretta, the home that once felt warm and safe now seemed cold and foreign. The absence of her laughter, her voice, and her comforting presence was like a gaping hole in both Sariah's and Thomas's lives. Thomas tried to keep the household together, but his efforts were met with resistance at every turn. Emily and Claire's hostility grew sharper, more direct. Without Loretta to intervene, they felt emboldened to express their resentment openly. "You should just send her away," Emily told her father one evening, referring to Sariah as if she were a stray animal. "She doesn't belong here." Thomas rubbed his temples, exhausted and emotionally drained. "Sariah is part of this family now. You need to accept that." Claire scoffed. "She's not family, Dad. She's a burden." The words cut through Thomas like a knife. He had hoped, naively perhaps, that time would soften his daughters' hearts. But it was clear that their bitterness ran too deep. Sariah, unable to bear the constant insults, withdrew into herself. She spent most of her time in her room, her small sanctuary away from the harshness of the outside world. But even there, she couldn't escape the memories of her mother or the unrelenting grief that consumed her. She often found herself tracing the scar on her cheek, as if it were the root of all her suffering. Every cruel word, every judgmental glance felt magnified by the presence of that scar, a permanent reminder that she would never be seen as beautiful or worthy in the eyes of Emily and Claire. Thomas tried to comfort her, but his own grief left him hollow. He was a man shattered by loss, struggling to keep himself and his daughter afloat in the storm of his emotions. Night after night, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty seat where Loretta used to sit, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. He had promised Loretta that he would take care of Sariah, that he would be the father she deserved. But now, with every passing day, it felt like that promise was slipping through his fingers. The house grew quieter as the days stretched into weeks, each moment thick with unspoken tension. Emily and Claire distanced themselves further from their father, avoiding him whenever they could. Sariah, too, withdrew, her presence in the house barely noticeable. Thomas found himself drowning in regret. He had hoped for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his family and find happiness again. But instead, everything was falling apart. And with Loretta gone, he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of a slammed door or the distant echo of muffled sobs. It was a house full of people, yet it felt emptier than ever. And in that emptiness, Thomas realized the painful truth. His family was slipping away from him, piece by piece, and unless something changed soon, there would be nothing left to save. The tension in the house became unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Emily and Claire's disdain toward Sariah grew more vicious. It seemed that without Loretta's presence to temper their cruelty, they felt emboldened, unchecked in their open hostility. Sariah, who had already lost her mother, now found herself battling relentless bullying in what was supposed to be her home. One afternoon, the situation reached a breaking point. Emily and Claire had invited a few friends over to the house, a social event that they purposely excluded Sariah from. Sariah kept to herself upstairs, hoping to avoid them altogether, but the sound of their laughter echoed through the walls, cutting into her solitude. From her bedroom window, she could see them gathered on the patio, glasses of wine in hand, talking and joking as if nothing was amiss. It wasn't long before they began talking about her. Sariah had become accustomed to their cruelty, but hearing them mock her in front of guests felt like salt in an already festering wound. "I don't know why Dad insists on keeping her around," Emily said, her voice loud enough for Sariah to hear through the open window. "She's like some stray cat that wandered in. No one wants her here." The group laughed, but Claire's voice cut through the noise, sharper and more cruel than ever. "Honestly, she's just a charity case. It's not like anyone will ever love her anyway, especially with that face." She sneered, her words dripping with contempt. "I mean, look at her. That scar? She's lucky we even let her stay in the same house as us." Sariah, listening from the shadows of her room, clenched her fists. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay quiet. She had learned long ago that crying only made things worse. They would only use it against her. As the laughter outside continued, Emily's voice rose again, her tone even more biting. And to think, she probably believes she can just coast through life. Like what? Does she think someone will come along and sweep her off her feet? Who would want her? Look at her. The words felt like knives, stabbing into Sariah's already fragile heart. She stood by the window, trembling, trying to hold herself together. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but what could she say? What could she do? She was alone in this, with no one to defend her, not even her father, who seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing day. Downstairs, Thomas could hear the laughter, but he was too deep in his own grief to pay attention. He sat in his study, staring blankly at the photo of Loretta on his desk, her smile frozen in time. The weight of his failure as a father pressed down on him, suffocating. He knew things weren't right with his daughters, that Sariah was suffering, but he didn't know how to fix it. Every attempt he had made to bridge the gap between them had only seemed to make things worse. Later that evening, after the guests had left, Sariah crept downstairs. The house was quiet now, the echo of earlier cruelty still lingering in the air. She found Thomas in the kitchen, nursing a drink, staring into the distance with a look of defeat on his face. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes tired and sad. He didn't respond right away, as if it took a moment for him to process her presence. Sariah hesitated, then continued, Do you think I don't belong here?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Thomas blinked, taken aback by her words. "What? No, Sariah, you belong here. You're part of this family." Sariah's heart ached at his words, knowing that they were meant to comfort her, but they rang hollow. She had heard what Emily and Claire thought of her, and it was clear to her that no matter what Thomas said, she would never truly be a part of this family. She was an outsider, and that would never change. She nodded slowly, though the tears that had been building up in her eyes betrayed her. I just don't know how much more of this I can take," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her sadness. Thomas stood and walked toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sariah, I'm sorry. I should have done more. I should have protected you. But Sariah pulled away, shaking her head. "It's not enough. It's not enough to just say you're sorry. You don't see what they do, what they say. I don't belong here. I don't want to be here anymore." With that, she turned and ran back up the stairs, leaving Thomas standing alone in the kitchen, guilt and regret weighing down on him like a heavy cloak. That night, Sariah made her decision. She couldn't stay here anymore. The house, once filled with her mother's warmth and love, had turned into a place of misery. She couldn't live another day being ridiculed and treated as less than human. She couldn't endure the constant reminders of her scar, the source of their cruel jokes, or the endless isolation she felt in a place that was supposed to be home. She packed a small bag, stuffing it with clothes and a few personal belongings. Her hands shook as she wrote a short note to her father, apologizing for leaving and explaining that she couldn't take it any longer. She didn't blame him, but she knew that staying would only break her spirit further. As she quietly opened the front door and stepped out into the night, the cool air hit her face, bringing with it a sense of finality. Sariah took one last look at the house behind her, the place where she had hoped to start a new chapter in her life with her mother and Thomas. But that hope had been shattered. There was nothing left for her here. The next morning, Thomas woke to the eerie silence of an empty house. He stumbled downstairs, still groggy from the restless night, and found the note Sariah had left on the kitchen counter. His hands shook as he read it, his heart pounding in his chest. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. She was gone. His daughter, his only connection to Loretta, was gone, and it was his fault. He had failed her, just as he had failed Loretta. The weight of that realization crushed him, leaving him gasping for breath. Thomas crumpled the note in his fist and fell to his knees, the overwhelming guilt suffocating him. He had let her slip away, and now he wasn't sure if he would ever get her back. Upstairs, Emily and Claire remained oblivious to the anguish that had taken hold of their father. They continued with their lives, unbothered by Sariah's absence. To them, her departure was a victory, another obstacle removed from their perfect, curated lives. But for Thomas, it was the beginning of his descent into despair. He had lost the woman he loved, and now he had lost Sariah too. The family he had desperately tried to hold together was crumbling before his eyes, and he didn't know how to stop it. Years passed like fleeting moments, each day blending into the next in a haze of monotony and grief. The house, once filled with tension and voices, now stood silent and empty. Thomas found himself alone, a man trapped in the prison of his own guilt. Sariah's absence had left a gaping hole in his life that nothing seemed to fill. The day she had left was etched into his mind, a wound that refused to heal. He had searched for her, of course, desperately at first, but it seemed as if she had vanished into thin air. His daughters, Emily and Claire, had drifted further from him as well. Emily, in her quest for financial independence, had taken a considerable portion of his savings to invest in what she had claimed was a foolproof business venture. Thomas, still in shock from Sariah's departure, had blindly signed over the funds, trusting his daughter's judgment despite his better instincts. The loss was staggering when Emily's investment crashed. In one reckless move, she had drained much of what remained of the family's wealth, leaving them on shaky financial ground. The humiliation was something Thomas had never prepared for. He was once a man of means, secure in his ability to provide for his family. Now, he faced the stark reality of his dwindling finances, compounded by the emotional wreckage that had already consumed him. It was as though everything he touched was destined to fall apart. Claire, on the other hand, had married into wealth, securing her future far from the crumbling remains of her father's home. She relocated to another city with her new husband, a rising businessman, and made it clear that Thomas was no longer part of her carefully curated life. Invitations to see his grandchildren were non-existent, and any attempts to reconnect were met with polite but distant refusals. Claire had moved on, and it seemed there was no room for her father in her new life. And so, Thomas sank deeper into despair. His once grand home, now neglected and deteriorating, became a symbol of his failures. Dust gathered in corners, furniture lost its luster, and the walls seemed to close in on him more each day. Without the laughter and warmth Loretta had brought into his life, everything felt hollow. The house, once so full of hope, now resembled a mausoleum of broken dreams. Nights were the hardest. Thomas would sit at the worn kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey his only companion, staring at the empty seat where Loretta once sat. Her voice was a fading echo in his mind, her smile a memory he couldn't hold on to. Some nights he thought he heard her footsteps or caught her scent in the air, but it was always just a cruel trick of his imagination. The emptiness consumed him, and he found solace only in the numbing embrace of alcohol. His routine had become a monotonous cycle. Wake up late, shuffle around the house, avoid mirrors that reflected the man he no longer recognized, and drink until the pain dulled. He had no purpose, no drive, and no family to ground him. His daughters had abandoned him, and Sariah was gone. His life, once filled with the promise of a new beginning, was now a slow descent into oblivion. One particularly cold night, Thomas found himself in a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. The regulars barely noticed him anymore. He was just another face in the crowd, another broken man nursing his drink. The bar's dim lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that matched the gloom inside Thomas's heart. He sat hunched over the counter, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, staring blankly at the amber liquid. The door to the bar creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air. Thomas didn't bother looking up. He had no interest in the outside world anymore. The bartender greeted the newcomer with the same disinterested grunt he gave everyone, and the door closed again, shutting out the wind. "Dad?" The word sliced through the haze of alcohol, sharp and unexpected. Thomas froze, his heart skipping a beat. His mind, sluggish from the drink, tried to make sense of what he had just heard. Slowly, he turned his head toward the voice, and his breath caught in his throat. There, standing in the dim light of the bar, was Sariah. But she was not the broken, scared girl who had left all those years ago. She was a woman now, standing tall and confident, her presence commanding the room despite its rough surroundings. Her hair was styled in natural curls, framing her face, and the scar on her cheek, once a source of so much pain, seemed to have faded into something that barely drew attention. She was beautiful, poised, and radiated a strength that took Thomas completely by surprise. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. Could this really be her? The daughter he had failed? The one who had slipped away in the dead of night, leaving him with nothing but regret? "Sariah?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His hands trembled as he set his glass down, his mind racing to catch up with the reality standing before him. Sariah smiled, though there was a sadness behind her eyes. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "It's me, Dad. I found you." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, ashamed of his vulnerability. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even known where to begin looking, and now here she was, standing in front of him like a ghost from the past, but so real and solid that it shook him to his core. How did you—" His voice trailed off, the words tangled in his throat. "I've been looking for you," Sariah said gently, taking the seat next to him. "After all these years, I couldn't just leave it like this. I needed to find you." Thomas stared at her, his heart a jumble of emotions, relief, guilt, shame, and overwhelming joy all mixed together. He wanted to say so much, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He could only sit there, staring at her, trying to believe that this wasn't some cruel dream. Sariah seemed to sense his turmoil. She reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture so simple, yet so powerful. "I'm here now," she said softly, "and I want to talk." For the next hour, they sat together, Sariah telling Thomas about the life she had built for herself after leaving. She had struggled, of course, There had been times when she didn't know where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep, but slowly she had found her way. She had worked hard, taken odd jobs, and eventually landed on her feet. She had built a life for herself, one that she was proud of. Thomas listened, his heart swelling with pride and sorrow. He couldn't help but feel responsible for the hardships she had faced. He had failed to protect her when she needed him most, and that guilt weighed heavily on him. But seeing her now, seeing the strength she had gained through her struggles, made him realize just how resilient she was. Sariah continued, her voice steady and calm. "I'm a mother now, Dad. I have a son. His name is Elijah." The news hit Thomas like a shockwave. A grandson? He had a grandson? His mind raced, trying to process this new reality. He had missed so much, so many moments. And yet, here she was offering him a chance to reconnect. I don't know what to say," Thomas finally admitted, his voice shaken with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Sariah, for everything. I failed you. Sariah shook her head, cutting him off gently. "Dad, it's not about what happened then. It's about what happens now. I didn't come here to talk about the past. I came here because I want you in my life again. I want you to meet Elijah. I want us to try and heal." Thomas stared at her, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He had never imagined this, never thought he would be given another chance. He nodded slowly, his voice cracking. I want that too." And for the first time in years, Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of hope. The night outside the bar was cold, the wind biting at their skin as Thomas and Sariah walked together through the dimly lit streets. Thomas could hardly believe that his daughter was beside him after all these years. Each step felt surreal, as if the weight of the past could still pull her away from him at any moment. Yet there she was, strong and composed, the woman she had become far removed from the frightened girl who had once fled the house. As they walked, the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Thomas was afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid that if he opened his mouth, all his guilt and shame would come spilling out, overwhelming the fragile connection they had just rebuilt. He didn't deserve her forgiveness, didn't deserve this second chance, but here it was, laid out before him like a gift he could scarcely understand. Sariah led him to a quiet park a few blocks away. The park, mostly deserted at this late hour, had a small playground and a set of benches where they could sit undisturbed. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows on the ground, and for a moment, Thomas felt the weight of his past pressing down on him even harder. The park was peaceful, but the turbulence inside him was anything but. They sat down on one of the benches, and Sariah was the first to break the silence. "Dad, I didn't come here to make you feel bad," she said softly, turning to face him. Her voice, though gentle, held a strength that belied the hardships she had endured. "I came because I needed to see you. I needed to hear your side of things." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat tightening. His side of things? He wasn't sure where to begin. His failures felt like a mountain too steep to climb, but Sariah's eyes were on him now, waiting for answers. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice hoarse. He dropped his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I failed you, Sariah. When your mother died, I just fell apart. I didn't protect you. I let them treat you so horribly, and I didn't stop it. I don't expect you to forgive me for that." Sariah watched him quietly, her face unreadable. "Dad, it was hard. What they did to me, how they made me feel, it broke me. For a long time I thought I was nothing. I thought I wasn't worth saving. But I also know you were hurting too. You lost Mom, and I can't pretend like that wasn't a huge loss for you." Thomas looked up, surprised by her words. But that doesn't excuse what I let happen to you," he said, his voice filled with anguish. "You were a child, Sariah. My child. I should have protected you, but instead, I let my grief blind me. I let them drive you away." Sariah sighed, a long, deep breath that carried the weight of years of pain. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting slightly as if grappling with her own thoughts. "It was hard, Dad. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done. But staying would have destroyed me. I had to leave to find out who I was without them, without their voices in my head telling me I was worthless." Thomas winced at her words. Worthless. How many times had Emily and Claire made her feel that way? How many nights had she cried herself to sleep, thinking she didn't belong? "I failed you as a father," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have been there. I should have fought for you." Sariah's eyes softened, and for the first time that night she reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "You're here now," she said quietly. "That's what matters. You're here now, and we're talking." Her words stunned Thomas. How could she be so forgiving? How could she even stand to look at him after everything she had gone through? But in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in himself for years. Hope. For the next hour, they talked, really talked, about everything they had both been through. Thomas told her about the years that followed her departure, how the house had slowly fallen apart around him, and how his relationship with Emily and Claire had become increasingly strained. He told her about the financial disaster Emily had caused, how Claire had cut him out of her life after marrying into wealth, and how lonely he had felt without her, without Loretta. "I lost everything," Thomas confessed, his voice raw. "Not just the money, but everything. I lost you. I lost my family, and I just didn't know how to fix it." Sariah listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. "You didn't lose me, Dad," she said softly. "I had to leave, but I never stopped thinking about you. I wanted to reach out so many times, but I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. I didn't know if you'd even remember me after all this time." "Remember you?" Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "Sariah, you were all I thought about. Every day I wondered where you were, if you were okay. I hated myself for letting you leave, for not being strong enough to stand up to them." Sariah smiled faintly. "Well, I'm okay now. I've been through a lot, but I've built a life for myself. And I want you to be part of that life." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He had never expected this. You want me in your life? After everything?" Sariah nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, I do. But there's something you need to understand, Dad. I'm not that scared little girl anymore. I've been through hell and back, and I've come out stronger for it. I'm not looking for you to fix things or make up for the past. I just want us to move forward, together." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent so long wallowing in guilt and regret that he had never imagined a future where he and Sariah could rebuild their relationship. But here she was, offering him a chance to start over, to be the father he should have been all along. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling. "But if you're willing to give me a second chance, I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Sariah squeezed his hand. "It's not about deserving, Dad. It's about healing, for both of us." The conversation shifted, becoming lighter as they talked about the present. Sariah told Thomas about her son, Elijah, his bright eyes, his laughter, the way he always asked questions about the world around him. She spoke with such love and pride that it warmed Thomas's heart. He had missed so much of her life, but now he was being given a chance to be part of her future, and that was more than he could have ever hoped for. "Do you want to meet him?" Sariah asked, her voice hesitant. "Elijah, I mean. I know it's a lot to take in, but I want him to know his grandfather." Thomas nodded, overwhelmed with emotion. "I would love to meet him," he said softly. "More than anything." Sariah smiled, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the night drew on, they walked back to the bar where Thomas had left his car. The cold air bit at their skin, but it didn't matter. The warmth of their conversation, of the new bond forming between them, kept the chill at bay. Before they parted ways for the night, Sariah turned to him once more. "Dad, I want you to come stay with us," she said, "at least for a little while. I know things have been hard for you, and I don't want you to be alone anymore." Thomas was taken aback. Stay with her? He hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined she would invite him into her home, but the offer filled him with a sense of relief and gratitude he couldn't put into words. I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Sariah nodded, her eyes softening. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said, "but we'll get through this together." Thomas watched as she walked away, the weight of years of guilt and regret slowly lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. And as he drove home that night, he couldn't stop thinking about the future. For the first time in years, it didn't seem so bleak. Thomas stood at the doorstep of Sariah's home, his suitcase in hand, feeling an odd mixture of nervousness and hope. The house was modest but well kept, with a small garden out front and toys scattered across the lawn, evidence of Sariah's young son, Elijah. The sounds of life, the barking of a dog, the distant laughter of children, filled the air, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had haunted Thomas's home for so many years. The door opened before Thomas could knock. Sariah stood there, smiling warmly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness as well. She stepped forward and gave him a brief hug, her embrace soft but full of unspoken words. Behind her, Thomas could see a glimpse of the life she had built. A bright, cheerful living room filled with toys and books, the faint smell of something cooking in the kitchen. "Come in, Dad," Sariah said, stepping aside to let him in. "Elijah is dying to meet you. He's been asking about his grandpa all morning." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped inside, setting his suitcase down by the door. The warmth of the house enveloped him, and for a moment he felt overwhelmed. It was so different from the cold, empty shell of his own home. Here, there was life, love, and hope, things he hadn't felt in so long that they almost felt foreign to him. Sariah led him into the living room where a small boy was sitting on the floor, playing with toy cars. He looked up when he saw Thomas and broke into a wide grin. "Grandpa!" Elijah shouted, jumping up and running toward him with all the enthusiasm a 6-year-old could muster. He wrapped his small arms around Thomas's leg, giggling as he looked up at him with bright, curious eyes. Thomas knelt down, his heart swelling with emotion as he gently patted the boy's head. "Hey there, Elijah," he said, his voice thick. "I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." Elijah's eyes sparkled with excitement as he tugged on Thomas's hand, leading him towards the toys scattered across the floor. "Do you like cars, Grandpa? I have a whole bunch of them. We can play together." Sariah watched from the doorway, her smile softening as she saw the two of them together. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of belonging, like he was finally part of something again. Living with Sariah and her family wasn't without its challenges. For so long, Thomas had been stuck in his old ways, accustomed to a life of solitude and regret. Adjusting to the rhythms of a family with its chaos, noise, and constant energy was difficult at first. The mornings were early, with Elijah bouncing out of bed and ready to take on the world before the sun had fully risen. Thomas, who had grown used to waking up at his leisure, often found himself groggy and disoriented as the day began with the bustle of breakfast and preparations for school. But slowly he began to find joy in these simple routines. He would sit with Sariah and Elijah at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee as the boy talked excitedly about his day ahead. It was the little things that brought Thomas back to life, helping Sariah cook dinner in the evenings, playing with Elijah in the backyard, and watching TV together as a family. These were the moments he had missed out on for so long, the moments that had once seemed so far out of reach. Sariah was patient with him, never pushing too hard or expecting too much. She understood that he was still healing, still finding his way back from the darkness that had consumed him for so long. But with each passing day, Thomas felt the fog lifting, felt the warmth of family pulling him back into the light. One evening, after Elijah had gone to bed, Thomas and Sariah sat together on the porch, the soft glow of the sunset casting a golden hue over the yard. The air was cool but pleasant, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt at peace. "You've done so well for yourself, Sariah," he said, his voice quiet but full of admiration. "I'm so proud of you." Sariah smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without everything you and Mom taught me. Even when things were hard, I always held on to that. You and Mom both made me strong." Thomas looked down, his hands fidgeting slightly as he thought about everything he had failed to do. "I wish I'd been stronger when you needed me most," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. Sariah reached over and placed her hand on his arm. "Dad, we've already talked about this. You're here now. That's what matters." He nodded, grateful for her forgiveness, but still struggling to forgive himself. "I just want to make it up to you," he said, "for all the time we lost." Sariah's smile softened, and she shook her head gently. "You don't have to make anything up to me. We're building something new now, together. It's not about the past anymore. It's about what we do moving forward." As the weeks went by, Thomas found himself settling into a rhythm. He began helping Sariah around the house, fixing things that had long been neglected and taking Elijah to the park on weekends. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. There was no longer a need to drown his sorrows in alcohol. He had something real, something worth holding on to. One particularly sunny afternoon, Thomas found himself in the backyard with Elijah, playing catch while Sariah prepared lunch inside. The boys' laughter filled the air as they tossed the ball back and forth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas found himself laughing too. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years he felt like he had a future. One day at a time, he was building something new, something that felt real and solid. He no longer felt like a man adrift, lost in his own regrets. Sariah had given him a gift he could never repay, the gift of family, of hope, of a chance to rebuild. And every day, as he watched Elijah grow and spent time with his daughter, Thomas felt that gift grow stronger. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Sariah looked over at her father with a smile that carried both pride and love. "You've changed, Dad," she said softly. "You're happier now." Thomas looked at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think I've finally started to understand what matters," he replied. "For a long time I thought I'd lost everything, but being here with you, with Elijah, I realize now that I still have so much." Sariah nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. "We're glad you're here, Dad." The conversation continued over dinner, filled with laughter and light banter. Thomas found himself absorbed in the moment, savoring the simple joy of being with his family. As the night wore on and Elijah was put to bed, he and Sariah continued talking, their bond strengthening with each passing day. Thomas began to see the world through a different lens. What once seemed bleak and hopeless now appeared full of potential. The small moments, the sound of Elijah's laughter, the sight of Sariah's smile, the simple joy of sharing a meal together, these were the things that gave his life meaning again. He found himself smiling more, laughing more, and, perhaps most importantly, forgiving himself for the past. In the mornings, when he woke up, the first thing he would hear was Elijah's voice, full of energy and excitement. And instead of dreading the day ahead, Thomas found himself looking forward to it. He wanted to be there for his grandson, to watch him grow and to be the father Sariah needed. He had a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The house, once a reminder of loss and grief, now felt like a home, a place where he belonged. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like he had truly found peace. He was no longer the man he once was. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined him. He was a father, a grandfather, and a man with a future. And that was more than he could have ever hoped for. Thomas stood outside the door of Emily's house, his hand hovering over the doorbell as he took a deep breath. The house was grand, much like the life she had built for herself, a life that had no place for him. The pristine exterior of the house seemed to mock him, a stark contrast to the emotional wreckage their relationship had become. It had taken years for him to reach this point, years of guilt and regret festering inside him, but now, after everything he had experienced with Sariah, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't move forward with his life unless he finally confronted the poison that had eaten away at his family. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. It was time to face his daughters, to face the toxic dynamic they had created, and to finally let go of the burden he had carried for so long. The door opened, and there stood Emily, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling over her shoulders. She looked surprised to see him, her brow furrowing slightly, as if unsure why he was standing on her doorstep after so many years of barely any contact. "Dad?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Thomas took a step forward, steeling himself for the confrontation that was about to unfold. "We need to talk, Emily," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I've been putting this off for too long." Emily's face hardened, her surprise quickly replaced with suspicion. "I'm busy right now," she replied coldly, glancing over her shoulder as if to indicate that his presence wasn't welcome. Thomas stood his ground. He wasn't going to be brushed off this time. "I don't care if you're busy," he said, his voice gaining strength. "This has been a long time coming, and I'm not leaving until we've had this conversation." Emily hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, letting him into the house. The interior was immaculate, just as he expected. Everything in its place, no sign of the chaos that had torn their family apart. He followed her into the living room where Claire was already seated on the couch, her expression unreadable. She looked up as he entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, this is a surprise," Claire said, her tone flat. "What brings you here, Dad?" Thomas stood in the center of the room, facing his two daughters. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. This was it. The conversation he had avoided for years, the one that would finally lay everything bare. "I'm here because I can't keep doing this," Thomas began, his voice steady. "I've spent years feeling guilty, feeling like I failed you both, and maybe I did in some ways. But what you did to Sariah, to me, to our family, it's time we talked about it." Emily crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't need to talk about the past," she said dismissively. "What's done is done." "No, Emily," Thomas replied, his voice rising slightly. "We do need to talk about it, because what you and Claire did was more than just a past. It was cruelty. You made Sariah's life a living hell, and I stood by and let it happen, but I'm not going to stay silent anymore." Claire scoffed, her eyes rolling as she leaned back on the couch. "Oh, come on, Dad. You can't seriously be dredging all this up now. That was years ago. Sariah made her choices. She left. What does it matter now?" "It matters because you never took responsibility for the way you treated her." Thomas shot back, his voice firm. "You tore her down, insulted her, made her feel like she didn't belong. And the worst part is, you knew what you were doing, and you didn't care." Emily's expression darkened, but she didn't say anything. Thomas could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "We were just kids, Dad," Claire said, her voice defensive. "We didn't know any better." "You were old enough to know better," Thomas countered, his voice tinged with disappointment. "And I was old enough to stop you, but I didn't. I was grieving, and I let that blind me to what was happening right in front of me. But that doesn't excuse what you did. It doesn't excuse the pain you caused her." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. "Why are you bringing this up now? What do you want from us?" Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with both sadness and resolve. "I don't want anything from you," he said quietly. "I'm not here for an apology, though it would be the decent thing to do. I'm here because I need to let go of the anger I've been carrying. I need to move on with my life, and I can't do that until I've confronted this." Claire shook her head, clearly frustrated. "You're wasting your time, Dad. We've moved on. Sariah's not part of this family, and she never was." Thomas's heart clenched at her words, but he remained calm. "Sariah is more a part of this family than either of you realize," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "She's my daughter, and she's Elijah's mother. I've spent enough time regretting the way things turned out, but now I'm choosing to be part of her life. I'm choosing to be part of the life she's building with her son. I came here today to tell you both that you're not going to hold me back anymore." Emily finally uncrossed her arms, her eyes flashing with anger. "So what? You're choosing her over us?" Thomas met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm choosing to do what's right. I'm choosing to be the father I should have been years ago. If that means walking away from the toxic relationship we've had, then so be it. I'm done letting your bitterness control my life." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Emily and Claire exchanged a look, their expressions hardening as they realized that Thomas was serious. "You've changed," Claire muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You used to be on our side." "I haven't changed," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "I've just finally woken up to the truth. I let you two manipulate me, make me believe that Sariah didn't belong, but I was wrong, and now I'm making it right." Emily stood up, her face twisted in anger. "Fine, Dad. If that's how you feel, then go. Go be with Sariah. We don't need you." Thomas nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "I'll always love you both," he said, his voice softening. "But I won't let you continue to poison my life. I've lost too much already." Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Emily and Claire behind. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, a weight lifted from his chest. It was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. He had finally said the things he had been holding inside for so long, and in doing so, he had severed the chains that had bound him to the past. When Thomas returned to Sariah's home that evening, he felt lighter than he had in years. The house was quiet, the soft hum of life surrounding him as he stepped inside. Sariah looked up from the kitchen, her eyes questioning as she saw the expression on his face. "How did it go?" she asked gently, sensing the gravity of the encounter. Thomas sighed, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It went as well as it could have," he said. "But it's done. I told them what I needed to say." Sariah nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said softly. "I know that wasn't easy." "It wasn't," Thomas admitted, sinking into a chair. "But I feel better, like I can finally move on." Sariah sat down beside him, her presence comforting. "You deserve peace, Dad," she said, her voice full of warmth. "And I'm glad you're here with us." Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. For so long, he had been lost in a sea of regret. But now, for the first time in years, he felt like he had found solid ground. He wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he knew one thing for certain. He had found his place in Sariah's life, and nothing could take that away. That evening, as they sat down to dinner with Elijah, Thomas felt a sense of contentment wash over him. He wasn't the man he once was, but that was a good thing. He had grown, learned, and healed. And now, as he looked at his daughter and grandson, he knew that he had finally found the family he had always needed. He was home. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. There are more powerful stories waiting for you. Just click on one of the videos here to dive into another one. Don't forget to like, share, and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one.